Have you ever watched someone smile at you while plotting to steal everything you have ever built? I have. And this is not a story about a helpless widow crying in the dark. No, this is the story of how I, Sylvia Hartley, smiled right back and then destroyed the man who mistook my silence for surrender. They say grief softens people, that lose makes you vulnerable, palliable, easily broken. But in my case, grief didn't something else. It curved me hollow, like a storm wrecked house still standing on the cliffs, quiet on the outside, structurally sound, but entirely vacant. My husband, Harold, died his sleep on a rainy Thursday morning. No final words, no grand gestures, just gone. And with him, 34 years of marriage, inside jokes, garden routines, and the quiet rhyme of tea at 4. People brought roses, they brought flowers, they brought pity in whispered tone. But no one noticed that while they mourned me, someone else was watching, circling. His name was Alistair Grant, a charming widower, a friend of Harold's. He came with stories of my husband's kindness, of business ties I never about, of financial matter I couldn't begin to understand. And slowly, kindly, he offered help. He became the one of who refilled my bird feeders. No one who replaced the light bulb I couldn't reach. The one who took over Harold's passwords, his accounts, his complicated estate, and I foolishly let him. They say grief makes you blind, but I was not blind. I saw it all. Eventually, I just waited because women like me were underestimated. We bake, we smile, we nod, and we plot. I grew up in Yorkshire in a small cottage with a garden that bloomed year around. My mother taught me the preserve jam. My father read poetry aloud while smoking a pipe. Our was a home. Our was a home where silence was comfort and emotions, like most British homes, were folded neatly away like laundry. Harold was my first real love, a historian, calm, kind, predictable. He was never rich, but he built stability with quiet pride. He wrote books that few read, but that are enough to keep us well fed and comfortable. He never had children, not by choice. After two miscarriages, we decided to fill our world with roses instead. The day he died, I was making shepherd pie. He had been reading in his armchair, glasses slipping low on his nose. When I found him, he looked peaceful, as if I had simply stepped out of time. The funeral was held on a grey Sunday. No rain, but everything felt wet. That's when Alistair came back into my life. Not with grand gestures, just cups of tea, sympathy, and a tone that suggested the understood. He had been widowed 3 years prior. He understood ec. He understood the paperwork, and slowly I began to rely on him. But grief has layers, and mine was thinning, shading, revealing something new underneath, something sharp. I gave up promotions at the museum just to make sure dinner was always warm with when he returned. I even quite I even quit my job entirely when he complained about how draining it was to have a working wife. He said the house needed a woman touch, and I believed him like a fool. Alistair, with his salt and pepper hair, tailored suits, and old school charm, made me feel like a treasure. At least in the beginning, he introduced me to his colleagues as my sweet Sylvia. But behind closed doors, I slowly became his housemaid, his emotional punching bag. His words shifted with the seasons, sweet in spring, biting in winter. At first, it was small, a joke that cut a little too deep, a missed birthday dinner, our forgotten anniversaries. Then came the isolation. Slowly, almost beautifully disgusting. I like frost killing a flower overnight. He had cancelled plans with my friends without asking. He had throw fits when I wanted to visit my sister. And if I ever questioned him behavior, don't be dramatic, darling. He had said with a sneer that made me feel like a child who had spilled milk on silk. I didn't realize it then, but Lister was a master manipulator, a narcissist dressed in a swile raw wool. And yet, I loved him, perhaps more than I loved myself. Till the day that changed everything. It began with whispers, soft, accidental truths that slipped from his phone when he forgot to close a chat window. The name Clara appeared more than once. So did next weekend and can't wait to see you in Paris. I would like to say I confronted him with fury. I wish I had screamed, thrown away was damned explanation, but the truth, I froze. I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at his phone for nearly an hour. The silence screamed louder than any confrontation. That night, I cooked his favorite rosemary lamb with red wine sauce. He said I was glowing. I smiled and kissed his cheek. I never mentioned Clara, but I started watching. Every move, every bank transaction, every dry cleaning receipt. Turns out weekend conferences were reduced in Europe. Clara was not his colleague niece. She was his 27-year-old personal assistant who looked at him the way I used to, with innocent awe. And when I finally saw them together, walking out of a hotel in Prague, he didn't see me. I stood behind a pillar, clutching a disposable camera like a wartime spy. Clutching like a disposable camera like a wartime spy. That's when something inside the shifted. The ache of betrayal began to alchemize into something else. No rage, no tears, tragedy. The weeks following Alistair's disappearance were a whirlwind of false condolence and fraudulent smile. His friends at the club find concern, whispering behind raised newspapers, as if my ears had suddenly stopped working now that I was a widow. But I was not grieving the man. I was grieving the years, grieving the time I had spent shrinking myself to fit the mold of his expectation, grieving the silence I had mistaken for peace, grieving the woman I used to be before Alistair's manipulation turned me into the fragile ghost in my own home. But ghost can haunt, and I intended to haunt the hell out of him. I started slowly. At first it was practical. I needed to understand what he had done. I began pulling out. I pulling at I pulling at the threads. Our bank records, offshore accounts, documents tucked into the attic in an old cigar box. And what I found chilled me. Alistair had not just spawned money from my side projects. He had laundered it. He had made fake companies, put properties in other names, taken loans against my name. The man didn't just leave me broken, he left me liable. It was when I found an old leather hidden in the linen of his vintage umbrella stand. Yes, really, that the full truth hit me like ice water. Lister had not left to escape a failing marriage. He had run from the taxman, from secret investors, from a woman he had promised to marry in Spain, while still married to me. He thought I had withered without him, that I had sit in a floral chair in some damn nursing home, nibbling biscuits and waiting to die. He forgot who I was before I became his possession. Sylvia Hartley, once a field agent for the British intelligence services in the 80s. It had been decades, sure, but training like that doesn't expire. I dusted off the old instincts and I made a plan. You see, what Alistair never realized was that I had once lived a very different life before him. A life of subtle codes, whispered exchanges, burning phones, and bluffing arms dealer in back alleys of Berlin. I may have traded fieldwork for marriage, but my memory was sharp, and I still had connects, but I still had contacts. So I opened an old friend. Codename Finch. Real name? You don't need to know. Let's just say she owed me a favor after I pulled her out of a particularly tight spot in Prague. She was skeptical when I told her the situation. You sure you won't get back in the ring of this sale? I'm not getting back in the ring, I replied. I pulled the bloody ring. Here's what we said. I used Alastair's old habits against him. He loved routine, predictable vanity. I had Finch trace to IPs he used when connecting his mistress through encrypted chat rooms. I know he couldn't resist checking on me, so I baited him. With fake posts, old photos of my crying, sad little captions, he took everything. But I forgave him. I was a lie. It was a lie. Of course, I didn't forgive him. I was waiting. We narrowed him down to the Costa del Sol, in a villa rented under a fake name. I flew out. No in heels and tweed like he remembered, but in muted grey like the weather. Practical, invisible. I scoped the place of days, observed his habits. Morning espresso on the balcony. Afternoon in the garden with that woman. He looked older, somehow more smug, sun kissed, and unaware that the hurricane he had left behind had grown teeth. I called the plan Widow's Bite, and it was time to strike. The night after the solicitors dropped their bombshell, I sat in the conservatory staring into the blackness of my garden. I hadn't not light a single candle. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat silently, boiling from within, because something inside me shifted that night. Something snapped. I realized I had spent my entire life being agreeable, nothing, and invisible. I had become the sporting character in a life I paid for, a home I built, and a story I never wrote. But this was not going to be the end of my story. No, this would be the beginning of a new one. One I would write, direct, and produce. Alistair mistook my silence for weakness. That was his first and greatest mistake, and I would make sure it was his last. I started planning like a journal going to war. I revived every legal document I had signed, every asset, every transaction. I spent weeks learning about trusts, shell companies, divorce loopholes, and forensic accounting. And I was not going to fight him in the way he accepted, through screaming or begging. No, I would fight him with silence, strategy, and something he never thought I had: ruthlessness. First, I changed my will. Every penny that Alistair thought he would inherit, I directed it into a fund for abused women over 50 trying to rebuild their lives. Fitting, was not it? Then I went through every expense and fund ways he had used our joint accounts for personal luxuries. Business class flights, watches, weekend at hotel he claimed were conferences. I compiled a private archive of evidence, but that was just the surface. Through a friend of my late brother who once worked with the government, I found a semi retired cybersecurity consultant. I paid him handsomely, and in under 2 weeks, he recovered deleted emails, encrypted files, and most damningly, secret financial transfers between Alistair and his mistress going back 8 years. It turns out the two of them had been draining my wealth quietly and planning their move for years. But here's where it gets beautiful. Alistair had been stupid. One of his hidden investments used for laundering funds into offshore accounts was still registered under a shell company that technically owned from back when we first launched our antique business. He never transferred it properly. I now had leverage. I invited Alistair and Lucinda for a final conversation, a symbolic closing of our chapter. Tea at the cottage, I said sweetly. We will sign the papers. He arrived smug, wearing his favorite cashmere scarf, one I had gifted him before I learned of his betrayal. Lucinda followed, high heels clicking, face botox smooth and expressionless. I served Darjeeling with lemon slices and warm shortbread biscuits, and then I slid the folder across the table. These are the documents I would like you to sign. They opened them and froze. Alistair turned white. Lucinda's jaw clenched. Because inside the folder was not a divorce settlement. It was a deed transfer, removing his name from multiple properties, sitting embezzlement and sealed affidavit with evidence of financial abuse. I told them, gently, that if they didn't sign, everything would be made public. Oh, and darling, I said to Alistair, I have made sure your offshore accounts are now unaccessible or inaccessible. I sipped my tea. He stared at me, speechless, for the first time in our entire marriage. I watched the predator become prey. It was a rainy Thursday evening. Alistair had returned from work unaware that the game was over, and I was about to make my final move. He opened the front door and walked into a candlelight dining room. Set for two. He raised an eyebrow. Sylvia, what's the occasion? I smiled sweetly, pouring him a glass of that aged red he always bragged out about at his gentleman's club. Oh, nothing, dear. I just thought we should have one last meal before everything changes. He looked confused, but that arrogance never left his face. Well, that's dramatic. He smirked. You finally going to forgive me for the girl in accounting? I chuckled. Oh, I have forgiven you for all of them. The moment he took the first sip of wine, I slid the envelope across the table. Inside, copies of his fogged offshore accounts, the legal papers showing he had signed over his properties to me under emergency delegation, and a letter from my solicitor informing him that everything he owned, everything, now belonged to me. He picked up the papers, scanned them, then again, and again. His smirk faded. What the hell is this? I leaned forward. It's the cost of mistaking a woman's silence for submission. Within 24 hours, his bank accounts were frozen. His Mercedes reposes. His mistress was called the court as a character witness. And his beloved family home sold at auction to a single mother's housing charity I personally supported. But I didn't stop there. The anonymous letter I sent to the tax authority, let's just say they don't take kindly to decades of undeclared offshore money. His face was plastered across newspaper with landline headlines like local businessman faces fraud, loses everything, wife speaks out. But I never said a word to the press. I let the silence speak volumes. That was a final touch of elegance in my revenge. People say grief makes you fragile, that widows shrink into their loneliness, but I deserved something different, something. Grief is the fire that frogs steal. And silence? It's not always thunder, it's tragedy. I never raised my voice, never threw a tantrum, never begged. I simply watched, waited, planned, and then struck with precision, grace, and the power of something who knows he has nothing to lose and everything to reclaim. Today I live quietly in a cottage by the sea. I volunteer at a women's legal clinic, helping others find the strength they forgot they had. People often ask if I miss him. I smile. I don't miss Alistair. I miss who I used to be before he tried to break me. And I cherish the woman I became because he tried. So that did you think? If this story stirred something in you, if you have ever felt silence, betrayed or underestimated, then know this. You are not weak. You are just waiting for the right moment to raise. And when you do it with silence, strength, tragedy. If you loved Sylvia's stories of smart revenge and quiet strength, hit that like button. Drop a comment below with they mistook silence for weakness, but it was her greatest weapon. Subscribe for more powerful stories about women who refuse to be broken and turn pain into poetic justice. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay strong.